The presidential campaign has entered its final stretch in the midst of social unrest, a deadly pandemic, and a troubled economy. We start the conversation there with former South Carolina Governor Mark Sanford. He's also served as a Republican congressman from that state. He challenged Trump for the 2020 GOP nomination. He's also launching a new nonprofit to help reduce the national debt and the federal deficit. Mark, thanks for coming back. Always good to see you.
Other way around. An honor to be with you.
Okay, let's begin right where we're at. 62 days until the election. How do you see it?
Jump ball. I mean, I think the trend line has been with Biden, but I see a bit of pushback as I talk to people across at least the state of South Carolina, and frankly, a number of other friends across the country, in that security is a big driver in any election, whether it's physical security or financial security. And I think that some of the rioting that we've seen in some of the different towns has gotten to that tipping point wherein some suburban moms that I've talked to have said, look, I don't like Trump. I don't like his tone. I don't like where he comes from. I think he is an absolute representation of everything I've not tried to teach my kids. But if he's the difference between somebody coming down to burn down Main Street in my hometown or not, then I'll put up with him. And so I see a little bit of swing back in his direction. But again, it's a jump ball, a long way to go, as you know, with 60 plus days.
The funny part about that is Trump says, elect me and I'll end all this. Well, you're the president and this is happening. That seems
exactly
hysterical
right.
to me.
Well, that's the pitch that's being made, and some people are biting on it. I'm not. I don't think you are, but I think that a number of people are.
You told the Post and Courier last week you decided you'll vote for Biden or not decide. Have you decided to vote for Biden?
I've not decided. I've said I'm not voting for Trump, but I'm not sure what I'm going to do.
All right, another former Republican congressman from South Carolina, Bob Inglis, has endorsed Biden. He says he wants his party back, but not at this expense. What do you make of that?
I agree with Bob. Bob's a thoughtful leader from the upstate of South Carolina. And I completely share his sentiment, which is I want my party back. I mean, I think there are a lot of us who are conservative Republicans who feel sort of lost in the wilderness of late. It's a cult of personality that doesn't fit with true conservatism, but it is what it is. And so a number of us are saying, where do we go? I mean, for instance, the party has completely abandoned whatever themes it believed in or seemed to talk about with regard to debt and deficit and government spending. I mean, spending and debt has exploded under the Trump administration, not in any way consistent with what conservatives supposedly believed, but he seems to get a pass on it, which leaves you in a wilderness if you're a true conservative and saying, what in the world are we doing here?
Why aren't there more Mark Sanfords? Why aren't more Republicans? We've had Colin Powell, a senator from Ohio. Well,
Right.
Why not more?
Well, it's hard to go against the stream in politics. I mean, there's an interesting book from a long time ago called Popular Delusions and the Madness of Crowds. And, you know, part of our survival as a species has been based on look to the left, look to the right. If they're not worried, I guess I'm not worried. And so particularly with politics, there's a herd instinct, and either out of self-preservation or political belief and advantage, people say, well, I'll just stay quiet on this one. And it can be the seeds of a party or a civilization's undoing.
Mitt Romney, though, will vote for Biden. You think more senators might come out?
I don't know. I mean, it's interesting to watch the phenomenon. I mean, Romney sort of went hard after Trump for a while prior to his being elected. Even, was allegedly courted with regard to Secretary of State posts. You see somebody like Ben Sasse, who had vehemently spoken out against Trump, but then got very quiet around the primary season. Now that he's secured the Republican nomination, he's speaking out again against Trump. It's just a tough place to go. If you look at myself, Bob Corker, Jeff Flake, and Justin Amash all spoke out vehemently against Trump, and we're all gone. I mean, it's extinction, political extinction that you're dealing with. people look at that and they say, well, maybe I don't want to go there. I think I want to stick around this
Yeah. So
place, and so it's just a hard
is
place
it
to go, and I get that.
is it in fact then, Mark, not the Republican Party? It's a Trump Party.
I think that's a fair assessment. Yes, sir. It's like nothing I've ever seen before in my political lifetime. It is very much a party of a single personality these days, which is the opposite again of traditional conservatism.
All right, in that area, the U.S. national debt is more than $26.6 trillion. That's 266, followed by 11 zeros. And you recently launched Americans for Debt and Deficit Reduction. First, what's the difference between debt and deficit?
So a deficit is the monthly credit card charge that adds up. The debt is the year-end total of all the debts that you've accumulated. And so, as you just pointed out, we have a magnificently huge national debt, and each month it's going up by our shortage, which is our deficit. It's a huge problem, and one that we ought to be focused on, and for some reason we're not. In that, historically, if you look at civilizations, the one thing that's killed civilizations off more than anything else across the history pages is too much debt and too much deficit. Civilizations just got to a tipping point, and they basically have to decide, do we go back to what made us competitive and perhaps a world power in the first place? Or do we stay on this happy but ultimately unsustainable cycle of upward government debt and deficit? And 9 times out of 10, they choose the comfy route to the seeds of that civilization's undoing. So this is an issue that ought to be important to every one of us on that level. It ought to be important from the standpoint of social equity. A lot of people are talking about social justice these days. And yet a deficit is nothing more than a deferred tax handed to my kids, your kids, grandkids. And our, that's the opposite of what our country was founded on, this notion of no taxation without representation. Now, you can cut it a lot of different ways. I think it's a very, very important issue.
A friend of mine said the problem with it as a campaign issue is the debt doesn't call you every Friday and ask for a payment. So
That's true.
I can't associate with it.
Yeah, but I think we're getting to that tipping point where people are going to very much associate with it, because a professor from Harvard and a professor from the University of Maryland, Reinhardt and Rogoff, wrote an interesting book entitled "This Time It's Different," talking about the way in which civilizations have extinguished themselves, and how there gets to be a drag on the economy when you get to around 90% of GDP. In other words, about 90% of the overall size of the economy, if there's that much debt, there begins to be a drag on the economy, and you can see interest rates rise and other sort of malignant things. That, I think, we're very, very close to, and then it will be knocking on the door come every Friday.
Has COVID-19 impacted this at all, impacted the budget deficit and debt levels?
Certainly. And therefore, again, I'm sympathetic to the idea of spending more based on a national emergency. But what you can't do, just as you wouldn't do it as a family or a business, is say, we'll ignore the realities of math and we'll just add, and add. So if you're going to add more to deal with this crisis that we're dealing with, COVID, well, then you ought to subtract somewhere else. And that we're not doing. And that's where it does become a national security issue, because Paul Kennedy wrote an interesting book years ago entitled "The Rise and Fall of Great Powers," and what he talks about how was the way in which economic supremacy in every instance was the precursor to military supremacy. So this is a social justice issue, it's a history issue, it's a military issue, and it's a bread and butter issue in terms of how much comes to your plate every Friday. But I mean, I would certainly say, yeah, it's not knocking on the door the way everyone else, so many other issues are, but it's going to be. And I think it's important we get ahead of it.
But if your daughter has a virus and there's a prescription for the virus, you don't care if that's going to lap over into next week. You're going to fill that prescription.
Yeah, but again, pay me now or pay me later, we can fill that prescription, and we should fill that prescription. but we ought to find some other place in government to trim the sails a bit. And that could be on national defense, where you have an unaudited agency and waste there. You could find a lot of waste in government where you could come back and say, we're going to trim back over here and add certainly to deal with this COVID-19 problem.
You've said more Americans need to be informed about the country's financial path. Well, okay, why aren't they? What's the reason that politicians don't? It wasn't mentioned at either convention.
No, you're right. To your point, politics is about the here and now. It's about the immediate. This is not perceived as here and now, but in fact it is, and that's the case I'm trying to make. People can learn more at Americans for Debt and Deficit Reduction, and you can get more pages than you'd like in terms of reasoning as to why they ought to care. But in political terms, to your point, as you said just a moment ago, it's not knocking on the door every Friday. And politicians typically respond to the issues that are knocking on the door every Friday.
Back to the election. Is Lindsey Graham in trouble?
I don't believe so. A lot of people are saying that's the case, but at the end of the day, it's a presidential year. And I think that numbers will revert in this state back to what we've seen in presidential years, unless there's a complete Democratic blowout.
Do you see the chance that Democrats take the Senate?
Absolutely. I think that could happen. I think a lot of it probably hinges on what happens in Maine and states like that. But, probably Olympia, probably has more to do with what's going to happen next in the Senate than anything else. I think that's a real, pivot point, if you want to call it that, in balance of power in the Senate.
You miss holding
Some days yes, some days no. It's funny, I've been involved in politics for 26 years, and my sons were all with me the night of my election loss. And to a boy, they said, "Dad, this is the best thing that could have ever happened to you. You've been miserable the last 2 years." And they were right. Trying to balance being a Republican in the era of Trump and be a conservative at the same time was a most delicate balancing act, and one that I think had me a little bit twisted up inside as I tried to navigate those waters. And so I think in that regard, it's a blessing to be out, but it's a blessing I love people. You love people, which is why you've been doing what you've been doing all these years. And so you're a bit removed from that, and you miss some of that.
Governor, great seeing you. Thanks so much for your time.
Yes, sir. Thank you.